A Teacher's History of the United States is brought to you by $49sites.com. At $49sites.com, their dedicated in-house team specializes in streamlining the site creation and maintenance process, all for as low as $49 a month. Use the offer code HISTORY at checkout to upgrade to the Pro package for no additional cost. Hello, class. Welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me today. Did you know that Benedict Arnold, arguably the most infamous traitor in American history, actually became initially frustrated following the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga in 1775? That at the outbreak of the American Revolution, Vermont wasn't an actual colony, but land in between New Hampshire and New York that was argued over for about a decade. And that right after Bunker Hill, Benedict Arnold, the quote-unquote hero of Fort Ticonderoga, convinced the Second Continental Congress that, hey, you know this war that just began? Well, I think we should expand it internationally now. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will learn that and more in episode 57. Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold, Ticonderoga, and Quebec. All right, welcome into episode 57. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am very excited today. I have a fellow AP US history teacher joining me today to talk about the ever so exciting topic of the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga. One Miss Nicole Johnston. Nicole, welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, of course. I'm glad you're excited because usually when people are on here, they're far from excited. So why don't you take a moment and tell everybody about yourself? So you teach AP US history, correct?
I do. I teach in Summit, New Jersey at an all-girls independent high school.
Okay.
So and our AP US students are a mixture of our juniors and our seniors. They have a choice if they want to take a junior year or senior year.
Gotcha. Okay, great. What is the most challenging thing about teaching AP US?
Those DBQs.
Yeah, the document-based questions.
Document-based questions. Every year, it's a struggle. So we try to bring in whatever we can to help them with those point of view. It's the point of view that gets them every year.
Yep. Yeah, it's not easy. And I won't totally nerd out here on the pod and go into deep detail about DBQs, but teaching document-based questions was never easy. It's definitely the bane of my existence as a former AP teacher. So, Nicole, when I offered up for various AP teachers or U.S. history teachers in general, you certainly don't have to be teaching AP U.S. history, to come on and add their 2 cents on specific topics that they teach about, why did you choose the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga in May of 1775?
So I kind of stumbled on Fort Ticonderoga when I was in college. Well, I mean, obviously I had learned about it in all of my classes and everything, but my college roommate, her family has a summer home up in Vermont, and I live in New Jersey, and so every 4th of July, and I still do, I would go up there to visit, and in college and a few years after college, I would take Amtrak from New York City up to Fort Ticonderoga, because then you can just take the little foot ferry. There's a little ferry that you can just jump on with your luggage, and then they would meet me across Lake Champlain in Vermont. Then a couple of times I would stop and do the tour of Fort Ticonderoga because I was right there, and I was going to have to wait a little bit for them to come and pick me up. And it kind of just grew into a thing that every year I would go and learn a little bit more about it and a little bit more about it and get to dork out before I, headed over into Vermont.
Okay, very cool. So a real personal connection for you with
so I was that weird girl walking with my luggage through Fort Ticonderoga, like taking everything in.
Yeah, no worries. That's okay. My 2.5-year-old daughter has been dragged to 4 or 5 different historical sites, and I'm the crazy guy dragging around a toddler while like genuinely trying to learn things.
Exactly.
No one's a big fan of that, especially my daughter. So let's jump right into it. Today's episode is going to be sort of a two-parter for those of you tuning in. Nicole and I are going to talk about the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga. And then I am going to cover on my own the expansion of the war into Canada and the failed assault on Quebec and sort of the embarrassing moment in Benedict Arnold and current Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery's history with the Continental Forces. But I love to, before we get started today, I would love to provide a little bit of context about where we are just to catch everyone up like I do each episode. And the last 2 episodes, we have talked about the Battle of Bunker Hill and the formation of the Second Continental Congress and the extension of the Olive Branch Petition. And one thing I talked about in episode 55 with the Battle of Bunker Hill, there are sort of 3 events going on in American history simultaneously at this time. It was the Battle of Bunker Hill, and then you had the formation of the Second Continental Congress, and then you also had the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga and the expedition into Canada. And so that's what we'll be covering today. And then after today's episode, we'll be hopping back to the colonies, down south, back across the border after we wrap up with Quebec in this episode and talk about the revolution. And Bill will join me next week and the week after to talk about the pamphlet called Common Sense and the writing of the Declaration of Independence. I'm really excited for both of those episodes for very specific reasons, and I hope you tune in and check them out. So when we think about Fort Ticonderoga, many of you may not be too familiar with it. As the Second Continental Congress is gathering in the second week in May, the Continental forces are traveling north up Lake Champlain to attack Fort Ticonderoga because it used to be a French fort. It used to be called Fort Carillon, and it was captured by the British in 1759 and more or less had fallen into disrepair because for the last 16, 17 years they hadn't really taken care of it because, of course, there's no French threat anymore. The French are out of the New World, so why spend time keeping up a fort like Fort Ticonderoga? So it was renamed Ticonderoga. It was nicknamed the Gibraltar of America because of its location, the river, and it was more or less seen as a passageway, so to speak, from Canada to the colonies. And back then, at the outbreak of the American Revolution, this fort still had an aura to it. Which is probably the best way to phrase it because really it was a dilapidated fort that had very few men manning it, so it didn't seem to be particularly important. But Fort Ticonderoga had this military significance to it based on the French and Indian War. Prior to the outbreak of fighting at Lexington and Concord, Fort Ticonderoga was of significant interest to many colonists in both the colony of New York and the region of New England because of its location and the fact that it had so many pieces of artillery that could be used in future conflict, which, Nicole, I know you'll get more into.
Yes.
So a few different reasons why Fort Ticonderoga was so important. Number one, it had a ton of artillery, which I just mentioned, which we'll talk more about. The British holding the fort also exposed the rear of the Continental forces, which would allow the British, at least in theory, conceptually, to cut the head off the snake, so to speak, and separate New England from the rest of the colonies, which they later tried to do. It was a supply and communication link between Canada and New York. And not only that, but if the British were ever to invade from a place like Montreal or Quebec, this would be right on the path of a potential invasion. So following the outbreak of war and the shots heard around the world at Lexington and Concord, General Gage recognized just how valuable Ticonderoga could be for all of the above-mentioned reasons and wrote to Governor Guy Carleton who was the governor of Quebec, telling him to reinforce the fort because he had a sneaking feeling that the colonists were going to try to take it. And Governor Carleton received the message, but received it about a week and a half after the colonists had already taken it. John Brown, an American spy who had been working as an information runner, went to the Massachusetts Committee of Safety following Lexington and Concord and told them about the fort and that it, quote, must be seized as soon as possible should hostilities be committed by the king's troops. And there's one man in particular, actually, I take that back. There are two men in particular who wanted to take Ticonderoga, but the first that we will talk about is one named Benedict Arnold, someone that you likely or at least recognize his name. And we will talk more and more about Benedict Arnold as this pod continues throughout the Revolutionary series. So I will just briefly give some background on him today. He was born and raised in Connecticut. He was the captain of the Connecticut militia. He actually grew up in a very wealthy family, but his father was a bit of an alcoholic and a drunkard. And so he torpedoed the opportunity Benedict would have had to attend a school like Yale, and it didn't quite work out for him. So here's a man who was brought up in sort of like rich stock in New England society, but everything did not work out the way he wanted to, and he had a huge chip on his shoulder. Like I mentioned, he was the captain of the Connecticut militia, and traveling down from Connecticut to Boston following the shots heard around the world at Lexington and Concord, he had heard reports of the fort being vulnerable, and he was familiar with it from his travels around that area. So he got to Boston and told the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, when he arrived in Boston, that they grant him permission to conduct a secret raid on the fort on May 3rd. But Ethan Allen was already at work, and the day prior, he had gathered 60 men from the Massachusetts and Connecticut militia. And Nicole, you probably know more about Ethan Allen and Vermont than I do. So why don't you take it from here?
Thank you. So Ethan Allen is actually kind of the opposite upbringing of Benedict Arnold in that he grew up in a very rural part of Connecticut to a farm family, grew up very much in a frontier upbringing. But his father really still valued education. And so even though he was out working in the fields all the time, his father was teaching him philosophy, sending him off to the schools in the area so that he could learn. And not just Ethan, but his brother Ira as well, who you're going to see is going to join the Green Mountain Boys later on to help in Fort Ticonderoga. And so then Ethan Allen, as he's learning all these philosophical teachings, he starts to become more and more involved in some of the land fighting that was taking place. As you mentioned, Vermont wasn't a colony at the time, and basically the land was in dispute between New Hampshire and New York. New Hampshire said that they had control of the land, and then Britain gave the land to New York, so New York's now saying, no, we actually have control of the land. And so Ethan Allen, he was a land speculator as he grew older, and he had gotten some land titles from New Hampshire, but specifically for land that would be in the southwestern part of Vermont. And as New Yorkers started coming into that land, he became very upset. And so that's when Ethan Allen formed the Green Mountain Boys, which is this basically an unauthorized militia that's going to be formed in Vermont. And his brother Ira is going to be a part of it. Even a couple of their cousins, one notable one, Seth Warner, is going to be a part of it. So it was kind of almost like a family affair in the beginning. And their whole purpose in the beginning was just to keep the New Yorkers out of Vermont. They wanted that land. They felt as though they had gotten these land titles. But then when they get wind of everything that's taking place as far as Lexington and Concord, they jump right into the Revolutionary War, and they're ready to take on the British in that war. But again, it's all because of these land titles in the beginning that they were really fighting for.
So if I could just pause you for one second and just clarify for my own purposes.
Yeah.
So if I remember, what was his name? Benny Wentworth, I believe, was the governor of New Hampshire, and he was selling these land titles, and guys like Ethan Allen would buy these titles, and they're in present-day Vermont, where the state of Vermont is today.
Right.
And he bought all of them, and then they went to a dispute, and like you said, Britain told New York, no, actually, that land is yours. So then New York, I'm trying to recall. New York then wanted guys like Ethan Allen, who had already purchased these land titles, at least from what he thought was fair and square,
Right.
to pay more or give up some of the land. And so then he created the Green Mountain Boys to basically create a private militia.
Yep, and they wreaked some havoc. I mean, they went around and destroyed some land and used intimidation and all those different tactics in order, to keep their space.
Classic.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's what they did during the Revolutionary time period.
Yep. Okay, gotcha. And so then they pick up word of Lexington and Concord, and they know that Fort Ticonderoga is vulnerable at this time.
Absolutely. And they also know, as you had mentioned earlier, just all the ammunition that's available there, the cannons. There's tons of artillery that are available. So they know, one, the location, as you had talked about, but also the value of everything that they could get from there because, the Continental Army is going to have nothing in the beginning. So this is going to be huge for them as far as getting some artillery to fight.
Gotcha. So walk us through how does this seizure, and I mean, I think calling it a battle is pretty generous. How does the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga go down?
It's true. Like calling it a battle is very generous because basically, and I think it's one of the cool things where as you kind of continue on, you look at a lot of these American Revolutionary battles, you're going to see that they don't use common war tactics. They're going to use different tactics in order to win some of these battles. And so with this one specifically, Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, they basically crossed from Vermont into New York. So they crossed Lake Champlain in the middle of the night. And so that way at dawn, they're basically surprising the soldiers who are stationed at Fort Ticonderoga without really even giving them a chance to defend themselves. So it was a very quick, as you said, very quick seizure. There wasn't really much of a fight that took place as they went in and took over because it was such a surprise that they came at that point in the day.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but so when we talk about Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, because those listening might be thinking, wait, hold on a second, which one led the raid on Fort Ticonderoga?
Right.
Ethan Allen more or less raised the Green Mountain Boys and said, well, I'm going to take Fort Ticonderoga, and did it unofficially, so to speak.
Correct.
And then Benedict Arnold went to the Massachusetts Committee of Safety and said, hey, somebody should really take Fort Ticonderoga, and oh, by the way, I'm more than happy to do it. And if I recall, he more or less raced to catch up to Ethan Allen, showed up, waved the commission in his face and said, hey, I know you're unofficially in charge, but guess what, dude? I'm officially in charge. Yeah. And they had a bit of a spat back and forth, and they agreed to lead the charge together.
Right.
So at least that's what Benedict Arnold says.
Well, and a big thing too is like, especially if you ever visit Fort Ticonderoga, they talk about the fact that a lot of the men who were assembled there basically said they would only continue on if Allen was taking the lead. And so that's when Allen and Arnold kind of went off to, a private location to have a discussion about it. They both said that then they would both be at the front of the troops. So that way all their men would feel comfortable following after them.
Yeah. And usually when one man shows up to a group of about 150 and none of them want to follow him, usually that's a message. But what we'll find out is that Benedict Arnold, while he was a pretty brilliant officer in the Continental forces and in the British forces, even though he does have a bit of a hiccup at Quebec, his hubris is almost unmatched, and his desire to get recognition and fame also unmatched. And I think the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga is a perfect example of that. Oh,
absolutely. And I mean, it was so easy in the sense that, because, again, they're going over in the dawn. There's literally one sentry standing guard at the fort.
Yeah.
And
so there's one guy.
Yeah, one guy and you have, I think it was like somewhere between like 80 and 90 between Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold and their men. Yeah. And he was kind of just like, what is going on here? So it was very quick. And once they got the general in charge, the captain in charge of the fort, he basically just laid down his sword. None of the Americans were killed in this. There was one casualty on the British side, but there's different reports as to how he actually died. It sounds like it was more of a confusing He got
I
confused
believe-
or something.
Yeah, and I don't even know if he died. I think the one casualty was an injury.
Okay.
I think he got knocked up on the head with a cutlass. And,
Yeah.
and had a concussion, and that was it.
Yep.
Like in the entire seizure of Fort Ticonderoga, one dude got like bopped in the head.
Right, which is kind of, and it's funny in the sense that it's not a battle or a seizure that you hear about when you're studying the American Revolution, but it's the importance of it after the fact that people kind of lose sight of.
Yeah, so why don't we jump into that? Like, what do you think? Because obviously you find some very significant effects, short and long-term effects to this seizure, because you wanted to hop on here and chat about it with me. So why do you think Fort Ticonderoga is so important in the broader narrative of the American Revolution and worth taking time to talk about?
So one of the things when I'm talking with my AP students, like I'm always trying to make connections between, the American Revolution and other battles, this and that. And, when you're talking to students today, it's like, well, we're America. We can take on anyone. They all have that viewpoint. And
yeah,
so,
of course we can.
Right, we're America. And so I'm trying to get them into the viewpoint of, okay, but back then we weren't Britain. If you think of Britain, how we feel about us being America today, that was Britain back then. So how did we do it? And so one of the big things about this is it was the first real victory for us in the American Revolution. It's considered the first real victory. And so it was a huge...
Yeah, because, and real quick, I just want to pause you real quick, and I don't mean to interrupt.
No, go for it.
For those of you listening to the pod, keep in mind that this episode is going to span about 4 months, and in the 4 months of this episode, the Battle of Bunker Hill happens. So in the official chronological narrative, the Battle of Bunker Hill has not happened yet. So Nicole is absolutely right in that the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga is technically the first quote-unquote victory for the colonies.
And it's important in the sense that it's a huge morale booster. And that's something when you're fighting, the best military in the world at the time, that's one of the things that's going to help us win the American Revolution. It's going to be these battles in which we're able to boost our morale. But then also it's going to be all, as we were talking about, the artillery we get. They get about 60 tons of artillery that they're...
I love how you say we. Oh, good old America.
Yeah, right.
Look at that. We. Yeah, I love it. Real
it's
patriot
like ingrained
here.
in me,
Yeah, of course.
But we're able to take that 60 tons of artillery to use it and set it up on Dorchester Heights, which basically is overlooking Boston. So later on, when you talk about the siege of Boston, one of the main factors why we're successful in that siege of Boston is because of all the artillery and the cannons that we were able to acquire from Fort Ticonderoga. So that's huge right there, because saving Boston from being captured from the British and being able to have that port open, and again, keeping us so that the British can't come and invade us from Canada later on is going to be important. And I'm sure when you go in to talk about Quebec, you'll talk about how we had hopes of getting into Canada ourselves.
Of course, yeah. Yeah. Good old America.
Exactly.
We set our sights high. Right?
Exactly. But I mean, definitely the artillery, the morale booster, the fact that it was seen as, maybe this is something that we're going to be able to do, that we're going to be able to beat Britain. And then the Green Mountain Boys we're going to see later on are going to go on and do some other, again, important little things that you're not going to probably read about in the history books or, find on that AP exam. But things
like what?
So, for instance, one of the things they do later on is they go and they capture part of Burgoyne's army at the Battle of Bennington, and that's important.
Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne.
Yeah, and that's huge because he was actually going to need that, army for Battle of Saratoga, and so we end up winning the Battle of Saratoga. And that's a huge turning point in the war, which, you'll get to later on in the American Revolution.
I'm getting there. Yeah. Don't spoil it all.
But, that you're going to see that's kind of like to build excitement for that podcast on Saratoga.
Oh, of course. Okay,
everyone will learn why it's so valuable.
I like it.
But, he lost a quarter of his army that should have been at that battle. And that was all because of the Green Mountain Boys. So just little disruptions like that. And I think it's just in general, if you look at the American Revolution, Fort Ticonderoga, to me, kind of sums up everything we see in the American Revolution as far as, not using the standard war tactics that were kind of used during this time period, the surprise attacks that we're going to see. And it's all those little things that lead to us being victorious in the American Revolution.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think that one more thing, which I mentioned last week a bit, that I think is worth bringing up again, is how the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga is going to put the Second Continental Congress in a bit of a pickle, because here they have to justify the proactive seizure of a fort, and what I'll talk about later in this episode after we let Nicole go and get back to her summer vacation, which is coming to a very fast end. Yeah, it's coming to a very fast end. But they'll take Fort Ticonderoga, and then they'll also take Fort Crown Point and Saint Jean, and then they'll move up to Quebec. And the Second Continental Congress. So here these men are trying to argue to King George that, oh no, we're still loyal to you. We're still loyal to Parliament. We're still loyal British subjects. And yeah, by the way, we do have an army up in New York that is raiding all of the forts and, going to war with your men, quite literally. But that's okay. You can ignore them. And so it does put them in a bit of a tough situation, which we'll talk about more detail in future episodes. Nicole, is there anything else before we head to the commercial break and I take over from there to dive deeper into Crown Point, Fort Saint Jean, and particularly Quebec? Is there anything else you'd like to say about Ticonderoga before we head out?
Go visit it.
Go visit it.
Yeah, if you have the chance, I mean, it's really cool because it's kind of hard. Like, I think this is with anything in history. You learn about stuff, but when you visualize it and you see the location of Lake Champlain, and you see how it's set up, that where that sentry would have been standing when, he's one guy, everyone's sleeping, and you have these 80 people showing up. It kind of makes a lot more sense. And then when you just see the view from it and everything, the beauty of the Green Mountains and, the Adirondacks and everything that's around it, I think it would just make more sense why the battle's so important.
And why the fort strategically is so important.
Exactly. Why Benedict Arnold, why they wanted it.
You're making me really want to go.
Yeah, you have to. It's an easy Amtrak ride. If anyone is Amtrak accessible, it's very easy to jump up there. And then you can take the ferry to cross Lake Champlain into Vermont.
Cool. I have to go to Penn Station down Baltimore and hop on the Amtrak and head up there.
Exactly.
Well, Nicole, thank you so much for hopping on the pod. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. If you're a U.S. history teacher out there and you'd like to hop on, if there's a specific topic that you'd like to cover, please give me a shout and we'll chat about it and see if it makes sense for you. Come on, Nicole, thank you so much. Good luck this year.
Thank you.
If you're listening to this live, it is the end of August 2018. If you're not, I'm just letting you know that Nicole's about to go back to school for another 9 months. I know that feeling. So have fun with all those AP students and good luck with those DBQs.
Thanks so much.
All right, see you, Nicole.
All right, bye.
Bye. All right, and we will head to a commercial break real quick, and then we'll be right back, and I will take you through the rest of the journeys north of the Continental Forces in May through the summer into fall of September 1775. A Teacher's History of the United States is brought to you by $49sites.com. That's the number $49sites.com. If you go to $49sites.com and use the offer code HISTORY at checkout, you'll be upgraded to the Pro package for no additional charge. I use $49sites.com to host my updated and fairly new still website, and I love it. They have a responsive web design optimized for mobile. They have hosting, daily backups, SEO, professional copywriting. They have contact forms and stock images. If you upgrade to the Pro package with the code HISTORY, you will also receive an SSL certificate, Google Analytics, a photo gallery, slider with up to 3 photos, promotional pop-ups, Google Map integration, and text animation, all for no additional charge. So check them out, $49sites.com. If you're frustrated by the upkeep of your current website or you're annoyed by the amount of time it takes for you to maintain it or to add new content to it, then $49sites.com might just be the perfect solution for you. So check out $49sites.com. Not only do I like them, but it also helps to support the podcast, and we really appreciate it. Okay, now let's move on from the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga to American failure further north. So Nicole and I just wrapped up our conversation on the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga. And following the seizure of the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga, and I should say the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga, to say it's a battle is really a bit of a stretch, the American forces continued north. And the next stop was the Fort of Crown Point, which was pretty easily secured as it was only defended by 9 different British soldiers, and that was taken on May 11th. Then Fort St. Jean, the next fort they took was Fort George, which only had about 2 soldiers, and that was also easily secured. The next fort after that was Fort St. Jean, which was on the Richelieu River and at the northern end of Lake Champlain. Benedict Arnold found out that the only British warship on Lake Champlain was there, and he desperately wanted to try to take it. After gathering some recon, he realized that the British were likely expecting reinforcements soon, so he acted immediately. He and 35 of his men rode all night, surprised the garrison, and took the fort, and were able to commandeer the HMS Royal George, which was a 70-ton ship. Arnold renamed the ship the Enterprise and loaded up a bunch of stuff into it and sailed away. Eventually, Ethan Allen's men caught up with him on the lake and they celebrated the victory. Allen's men had rowed nonstop, get this, for 100 miles to catch up to them and help in the endeavor. Allen considered trying to hold Fort St. Jean, but recognized that he could not hold up against the approaching British reinforcements, so he decided to leave it. Arnold largely took control of the operation for a while at Fort Ticonderoga and had a base out of the previously seized Crown Point. Eventually, Connecticut sent Colonel Benjamin Hinman to take over Fort Ticonderoga, and Arnold, understandably, was furious when he was informed that he was no longer in charge after all he had done. He resigned his commission and went home after he had spent so much time and effort and even about 1,000 pounds of his own money on the campaign to capture Forts Ticonderoga, Crown Point, Fort George, and Fort St. Jean. Following the capture of these 4 forts and the subsequent dismissal by Benedict Arnold, or of Benedict Arnold, by Colonel Hinman, Congress and Benedict Arnold still had their eyes on Canada. The overall strategy of this Canadian expedition, which I'm about to go into more detail about, was to take both Montreal and Quebec. George Washington recognized that if they took simultaneous campaigns on both Montreal and Quebec, it would be far more difficult for Guy Carleton to defend, who was the governor of Quebec and the overall commander of the British forces. Following Ticonderoga, Arnold and Allen both recognized that the province of Quebec was lightly defended with probably only about 500 to 600 total British troops. Arnold was firmly of the belief that the French-speaking Canadiens, or the Quebecois, as they were called, would be favorable to the colonial forces if they were to try to lay siege and take the city and take the fort. After some convincing, the Second Continental Congress finally agreed that Quebec should be taken and assigned the overall planning of the invasion to Major General Philip Schuyler. Benedict Arnold was angry because, of course he was, that he wasn't given the commission for the overall command, so he went to George Washington and proposed a second invasion force, this one from the east. Now, George Washington was a bit leery of Arnold and probably annoyed by his hubris in certain ways, but he recognized that his ambition, his strategic approach, and his vigor would serve the Continental Congress and the Continental Army especially quite well, so he approved of Arnold's plan. Arnold's trip was to take them through the woods, marsh, and swamps of present-day Maine. And if you've ever been up to Maine during the summer and the spring, it is some difficult, it's extremely mountainous, and it is rugged terrain up there. And I can only imagine how difficult it was during the late 18th century to navigate. Now, Arnold had planned on this trip taking about 20 days and ranging about 180 miles. And if you know anything about this battle, you can tell what I'm alluding to here. It took a lot longer and was a lot further. He was able to raise about 1,100 total men for the campaign, and the only real concerns were that the Canadians and the natives likely wouldn't side with the Continental Army, or maybe wouldn't side with them. But George Washington had secured assurances that that wasn't the case, and the natives of the area and the French Canadians would be in favor of a Continental Expedition. After a couple different delays, the expedition began on September 11th, but then was delayed again until September 25th of 1775. They left from Fort Western, which is near present-day Augusta, Maine, and for the most part, this march was not planned out particularly well. Different groups of men would bump into each other one day and then find themselves separated by miles apart a few days later. They basically traveled in these large packs of soldiers as opposed to a very regimented, disciplined, and organized march. About a month later, after a couple different bad turns, floods, and the bateaus overturning. Bateaus are like very shallow wooden ships that the soldiers could get in and try navigate along the twisty rivers. After a couple of those boats overturned and in turn ruined all of the food stores, Arnold had to be forced to consider turning back. But after some contemplation, he decided not to. But not everyone stayed with him. Under pressure from his men, Lieutenant Colonel Enos and 450 of his men did decide in late October that they were going to turn back. And Enos was actually later court-martialed for his cowardice and refusal to serve under Arnold, even though he was eventually acquitted. Without the food stores, things became extremely desperate. The men were getting lost in the swamps, and they were both miserable and starving. They ate soap, hair grease, and even shoe leather. And things got so bad that Captain Henry Dearborn's dog was eaten as a meal by his men. And then they took the bones and kept the bones so they could make bone marrow broth. On November 9th, Arnold finally arrived across the river from Quebec and only had about 600 of his original 1,100 men. And the journey ended up being 350 miles, not 180. Arnold arrived at the fort, manned by, at this point, way more men than they thought, about 1,800 men, who were not starving and exhausted. Arnold and his men demanded their surrender, which that's a bold move, considering the circumstances, and unsurprisingly, the British said no. So he decided to retire and wait for General Montgomery to arrive, about 20 miles upriver. General Montgomery had just taken Montreal, and he had also been handed overall control of the mission by Schuyler after Schuyler had fallen ill. Montgomery was a popular general and looked up to by many of the soldiers in the Continental Army, including many of Arnold's men. When he did arrive, he brought with him men, of course, supplies, and much-needed resources to the army. Arnold surrendered control of his forces to Montgomery, and they began to plan their assault on the city. At first, they decided to lay siege to the city and sent another note to Carleton asking for surrender, but Carleton was not interested. While Montgomery's artillery were in good position for the battle, they were not big enough to do any real significant damage to the walls of the fort. Resupplies weren't coming, their siege artillery wasn't going to do the trick, and Arnold's men, and some of Montgomery's, were having their enlistments run out at the turn of the new year, January 1st, 1776. And they could not afford to wait for more reinforcements, because not only would they have men who would then turn in their enlistments and retreat and run away because they didn't have to serve anymore, but also the British would have time to reinforce the fort even further. So if you think about the fort of Quebec, and I will try to be as simple as I possibly can for you here, because I know it's difficult sometimes when you're listening on audio to get a real visual of what we're talking about. So I will make it as simple as I possibly can. if you've ever seen a greater than sign, right? So it's basically like a sideways 2/3 of a triangle. Or if you think of like a slice of pizza with the crust on the left side and the point of the pizza pointing to the right, Quebec was basically, and I know this is a horrible oversimplification, but I'm trying to make it easy for you. Quebec was basically in that shape, in that triangle shape. It jutted out into the St. Lawrence in that triangle. And what will happen if you think of it like a slice of pizza, right, is that the American troops are on the crust. So they're on the northwest side of the fort, and if you look at a map, it would just be really west and east, left and right. They're on the west side, so they're facing Quebec, and there are large walls on the western side of the fort. And Quebec is basically broken up into two different parts of town. You have Upper Town and you have Lower Town. And Lower Town is where like the point of the pizza would be on the east side. That's where Lower Town is. And I want you to have that understanding. So when I describe the actual mobilization of forces and execution of the battle, you'll understand it. So the Americans are on that. If you're thinking of a map of Quebec, and it's sort of like this wedge shape, right? Americans are going to be on this left side, and they're going to have a bit of an interesting approach to it. So Montgomery decided that he was going to advance from the south, and Arnold would advance from the north. So Montgomery would basically trail along the edge of the land around the fort's walls to the south. Remember, they're trying to go for that point in the wedge or the slice of pizza, and that's lower town, and that's where they're trying to go. And so Montgomery would go to the south, and Arnold would go to the north. And the idea is that they would then wrap all the way around, and they would meet up jointly in that Lower Town, in like the pointed part of the wedge. Meanwhile, they would have a couple different men do feints, like pretend to attack the western part of the fort, which would be where the pizza crust would be, right? And so the idea is that the British troops would be distracted by those feints, and while they're distracted by those feints on the western walls, Arnold would be going to the north, Montgomery would be going to the south, and they'd meet up in the east, and then they would attack the eastern walls in Upper Town afterwards. That was the idea. On top of this, following the seizure of this fort in 1759, after the French-Indian War, when the British were able to take it, there were many American merchants who had moved into Quebec for business reasons. And these people were called old subjects. And these were colonist families who had been in the colonies forever, who had recently moved into Quebec to, make money there and make a new life for themselves. And Montgomery and Arnold were pretty sure that if they were able to meet up in Lower Town and take Lower Town, these old subjects would then be able to convince Guy Carleton to turn over Upper Town and turn over Montreal to the English, because they would have been, obviously partial to the British forces. So that was the idea. And Montgomery knew that the only way he was really going to be able to take this and execute this battle plan is if a storm came. And fortunately for him, on December 30th, quite literally 2 days before the enlistments ran out, a nor'easter came. And Montgomery figured this would be the best possible opportunity and decided to attack that night. So in the early morning hours, like 2-3 a.m. on New Year's Eve of 1775, Montgomery and Arnold gathered their men and prepared for this frigid approach through the heavy snow. Montgomery, like I mentioned, led his men along the southern defenses, and at this point the storm had become a blizzard. And I want to cover Montgomery's approach first, and then I'll talk about Arnold. Montgomery and his men traveled through two different undefended palisades, which are basically like walls, right? It could be made out of wood or it could be made out of stone. Usually they're made out of wood. And then he eventually encountered a third palisade and assumed that one was also undefended. So he sped up his advance, and when Montgomery and his men did that, they were mowed down by musket fire and cannons, Montgomery included. He was killed instantly by a cannon grape shot to the head. And his next two most senior officers also died. So December 31st, 1775 was a crushing blow for the Continental forces. And it was another crushing blow for the United States because the guy that survived the retreat, none other than Aaron Burr. Yes, that Aaron Burr, the guy who will later, in 1812, kill Alexander Hamilton. While Montgomery's men were being stopped at the third palisade and forced to retreat, Benedict Arnold and his men had no idea. And they more or less were walking into disaster, but Arnold didn't know this. As Arnold and his men advanced, the defenders, having been alerted by citizens of Quebec because they saw the lanterns of the Continental forces, opened fire on his approaching men. The walls of the fort were too high to return fire adequately, and their cannon was stuck in a snowdrift and had to be abandoned. So Arnold decided to run forward past the enemy fire in a blizzard through a city that no one was familiar with. You can imagine the chaos that ensued for these Continental forces as they tried to organize themselves in this very quick charge through the city. Arnold was hit in the leg and injured, and the command of his forces was then left to one Daniel Morgan. Daniel Morgan led the scaling of the wall and was able to take the barricade. How? Because Daniel Morgan is awesome, and he is someone we will talk about more in this podcast as we move forward. Morgan was finally able to get his men to charge again with him, and he ran through the street yelling, "Quebec is ours! Quebec is ours!" After about 500 British troops traveled to the first barricade that Arnold's men had passed and trapped Morgan's men behind them, his men, along with other Continental forces, eventually surrendered to the British under heavy fire and they had wet musket powder, so they couldn't really fire back. Arnold decided to hunker down and lay siege to the city afterwards, to little effect. So by this point, Montgomery had died, Arnold was injured, and Daniel Morgan and about 300 men, over 300 men, had been captured. And Arnold, stubborn old Benedict Arnold, refused to admit that this was a lost cause. Disease, brutal weather conditions, and smallpox ravaged Arnold's men over the coming months. It was reported that the smallpox infestation was not a mistake, as Carleton would send out ill civilians from behind the city walls to infect the American soldiers, including sending out some prostitutes with the disease, who would in turn pass it on to lonely soldiers. Carleton, having served under James Wolfe during the siege of Quebec during the French Indian War, knew that Montcalm had made the fatal mistake of leaving the city walls to encounter British troops in 1759. And now that the tables were turned, he was not going to make that same mistake. Quebec was one of the most secure fortresses in the world, especially in North America, and he was going to use that advantage to his advantage. Eventually, in the spring of 1776, after Arnold had been relieved of command and congressional efforts to win over the citizens of Montreal and Quebec had failed, the American forces decided to give up the siege and retreat south. Carleton, smelling blood in the water, was determined to pursue the American forces and try to take back all the forts that had been conquered in 1775, defeating Benedict Arnold again at the Battle of Valcourt Island and taking back Crown Point. The British gave up their pursuit prior to taking back Ticonderoga because the war season had ended and they wanted to settle down for winter. And that's where we will leave off in this podcast, because I don't want to get too far ahead in 1776, because obviously we have a lot to talk about before we get back to this narrative. As you pack up your things, I'd like you to keep a couple thoughts in mind following this episode. The battles in the north were bittersweet for the Continental Army. The initial seizure of Ticonderoga, Crown Point, Fort George, Fort St. Jean, and even Montreal were positive psychologically and provided momentum for the cause. But the failure at Quebec and subsequently at Valcourt Island was nothing short of devastating. This was the first official American defeat. The American colonists expected the local Canadian population to support them, but found out the hard way that that did not happen. Because in the end, the Quebec Act of 1774, which had provided promises of the backing of the Catholic Church and preservation of French culture, really had made the locals become okay, for the most part, with the idea of British rule. Following these battles, General John Burgoyne will arrive with about 9,000 troops to Quebec and eventually try to march south in a planned attack where he will be thwarted, and Benedict Arnold will eventually gain his revenge at the Battle of Saratoga. Congress considered taking Canada a couple more times during the war after the victory at Saratoga, but chose against taking action for a variety of reasons. Additionally, following the war, the American delegation wanted present-day, so get this, following the Revolutionary War, the American delegation actually asked for present-day Ontario and southern Quebec province in their concessions. But since they never actually controlled any of it for any legitimate length of time, they had little negotiating power, and the British refused to budge. Just a really big what-if to the Battle of Quebec in 1775. Next week, my fellow history nerd Bill Gorman will be hopping back on the pod because we are going to talk about the spread of revolutionary thought throughout 1776. While Arnold and Montgomery were laying siege to Quebec, Arnold was laying siege to Quebec after the failed attempt to take the fort. And during the subsequent months, as he was retreating south and Carleton was chasing him, the colonists in present-day United States were starting to slowly become convinced that maybe this whole revolution idea wasn't such a bad idea after all. And that was supported by a pamphlet called Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine and distributed in the early months of 1776. Bill and I will talk more about Common Sense next week and the spread of revolutionary thought throughout the colonies and the slow turning of the social and political tide. Thanks for listening. And hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. Thanks again for tuning in. If you would like to raise your hand and participate, please feel free to find us on Facebook, reach out on Twitter @ATeachersHist, and if you could leave a rating or review on iTunes, that would mean a ton. Shout out to our newest patron, Pedro, and longtime listener. We appreciate the support. We appreciate all of your support if you're able to give it over on our Patreon page, www.patreon.com/ateachershistory. Anything you can give to help support the pod and keep this going would be much appreciated and a huge help. See you next week.